Do you think there could be, in the meanwhile, any kind of a settlement or change in the relations? And what this visit of John Kerry could also mean?
It's very clear the United States and Russia are talking, and one of the prime topics they're talking about is Ukraine. So I would argue that there is a possibility of a settlement that the Ukrainians may not like, but it would consist of this. First, an agreement that Ukraine will not involve itself in Western alliance structures that are military, but is free otherwise to engage in whatever activity it wants. That some degree of autonomy will be given to the eastern provinces. Doesn't have to be major, but symbolic. And some sort of attempt at a settlement on Crimea. The problem that really exists is this. Can the United States trust the Russians to respect Ukrainian neutrality? Can the Russians trust the United States not to build a military capability in the Baltics, in Poland and Romania, which it is building, that will not eventually threaten Russia? So the problem with the settlement is what comes after. And neither side has any reason to trust the other, because these are nations and they do what is in their interest. So in a way, the Ukrainian issue by itself is probably manageable. The problem is it is now escalated to the level that involves other things, such as the American alliance structure in the eastern flank of NATO, and it involves the deep crisis in the Russian economy because of the collapse of oil prices. So the Russians have to wonder, can they make concessions in Ukraine at a time of such economic crisis? And the United States has to wonder, if the deal doesn't work, how fast and how far will the Russians come? Washington's role is that it has created a military force in the east, in Poland and Romania. Russia's involvement is that it represents a military power that threatens Ukraine. Berlin and France, in that sense, don't play in this league. So, if the United States gets upset or Russia gets upset, something can happen. If France gets upset, what will happen? So you have to understand there are nations that have consequences in the region and nations that don't.
Big things are not really done and people are just waiting.
From an American point of view, Ukraine, I'm sorry to say, is not a big thing.
Yeah.
So it can be done. You know, the Europeans don't understand the United States. They think that the American president is like a king. He has limited power, and as we saw, they don't decide what they're going to be involved in. George W. Bush never thought his presidency was going to be about 9/11, and Obama thought that everybody would like him. In the end, he's an American president. So it has to be understood by the Europeans is that beneath the noise of American elections, there is a stability in the United States because Washington is not that important. I mean, Washington is a place where politicians go, and America is a country that everybody's in civil society, corporations. And how we make a living is far more important to us than what Washington thinks or doesn't think. But every 2 years, Congress has to be reelected. So I think Europeans think of the American election as a European election, where a new prime minister with a majority in the parliament can make changes. There's deep continuity in U.S. foreign policy, and if you go back many years, you'll see it. I think Syria and Ukraine have always been connected in a certain way. The United States humiliated the Russians in Ukraine. Russian intelligence failed to understand what was happening in Kiev and made it swear. They failed to create an uprising in the east. They failed to defeat the Ukrainian forces, simply outright. And they blamed the United States for this. They therefore have been dueling over Syria from the time of the chemical weapons, saying that Obama broke his word on that, to their intervention. They also helped the United States a great deal by intervening in Syria. The United States was opposed to Assad. However, they were frightened if at this point if Assad fell, ISIS would take over. The United States could not defend Assad for political reasons, diplomatic reasons. Russia solved the problem. Assad survived, ISIS can't move, and so on. I think the Russians understood that in offering this to the Americans, they might open the door to negotiations on what to them was a much more important issue, Ukraine. And I think it's in that context that the Kerry visit and things of that sort have to be taken. A dialogue opened when the Russians announced they're withdrawing the bulk of their forces, but leaving Assad intact. So I think, yes, there is a connection between the two. Not necessarily a negative connection, but it opens the door to a level of trust between the US and Russia that may make it possible to have a conversation. The European Union is fragmented. The Russians know it. The Russians aren't worried about anybody in Europe getting in their way. They've handled sanctions very nicely. What they really are worried about is the United States. But the point that I'm making is the European Union is failing. No amount of meetings is going to make a difference. And just because it's going to make the Europeans braver or something does not mean that the Germans are going to agree to stimulus for France. Well, I mean, the thing to really watch out for is what is happening in Kiev. I mean, if the Europeans are offering relations with NATO, this is a red line for the Russians. We already crossed that red line in the Baltics. If we cross it in Ukraine, the Russians, for both domestic political reasons and strategic reasons, will have to react. So you always have to put yourself in the mind of the other side. What can they take, what can they not take? The Russians have made it very clear that they will allow this frozen conflict, if you will, to continue. But if the Ukrainians try to unfreeze it, then they will do what has to be done.
Yet sometimes says that the weakness provokes Russia, like non-action, vice versa, rather than action.
Russia in general and Ukraine, given how important Ukraine has been, have behaved in a relatively minor form. Intelligence operations, green men, things of that sort, none very effective. It is not weakness that frightens them. It's NATO that frightens them, the Americans that frighten them. And of course they should be. So there's a part of the settlement is the Ukrainians' hands. The thing that frightens the Russians is being part of the military alliance. NATO doesn't frighten them. Ukrainians speaking Russian doesn't frighten them. So I would argue that a great deal of the future of the Ukraine is actually in the hands of the Ukrainians.